Okay, here's a little bit more information on Nietzsche, a couple more clips, some additional info on Nietzsche's conception of human nature, his apparent criticism, his conception of human nature in terms of the feeling of power and the actual attainment and expression of power. I'll make that distinction. I'll mention a few things about Nietzsche's apparent rejection of democracy and egalitarianism, and also finally I'm going to make I'll have some comments on Nietzsche's apparent nihilistic tendencies, or his nihilism. So, Nietzsche's historical conception of human nature as a complex biological and cultural phenomenon, in other words, his expression of the will to power, allows him to draw, I think, qualitative distinctions between different ways of being and acting. A crucial element of his understanding of human nature is the feeling of power. This feeling of power is an essential aspect of human moral agency, of human emotional agency, in addition, as it develops over time, as both develop over time. The layers of feeling and interpretation in every human action imply a complex relationship between the increase or decrease in the power of an individual and his or her resultant feeling of power, the actual attainment of power and expression of power, and his or her feeling of power. As the long history of magical, superstitious, and religious practices shows, there is no necessary connection between feeling of power, between the feeling of power, and between the actual attainment and expression of power. What is experienced as an example of this, what is experienced as a diminishment of power, in other words, suffering, may in fact be a means to the enhancement of an individual's capacities, of an individual's capabilities in all realms, intellectual, cognitive, of course, rational, emotional, and moral. Nietzsche insists upon the importance of suffering and on the short-sightedness of those who advocate the elimination of suffering in all of its forms. By failing to see the asymmetry between increased feeling of power and increased actual power, we fail to see that his qualitative distinctions between stronger and weaker forms of life, that is, active and reactive forms of life, or active and reactive forms of power, actually, to be more specific, do not imply that human nature necessarily involves hostile forms of exercise of power over others. Thus, while he points out that one of the most common ways to achieve the feeling of power throughout history has been the forms of cruelty practiced in various types of entertainment, punishment, various types of punishment, various types of homage to the gods, for example, he suggests that doing harm to others is a lesser means of producing a feeling of power in oneself than are acts of benevolence towards them. In other words, the desire to hurt others is a means of obtaining the feeling of power characteristic of relatively weak persons. Insofar as the history of culture has involved a history of cruelty toward others, it is because it has been overwhelmingly a history of slavish type of human beings whose primary mode of acting is reactive and negative. Enhancing one's feeling of power by assisting or benefiting others is a characteristic of strong or noble individuals. Strong, he calls it noble types. The type person, or the type man, he says, the noble type. The noble types are defined by their power over themselves rather than by their power over others. He says this: in the foreground there is the feeling of fullness, of power that wants to overflow, the happiness associated with a high state of tension, the consciousness of a wealth that wants to make gifts and give away. The noble person helps the unfortunate too, although not or hardly ever out of pity, but rather more out of an impulse generated by the overabundance of power. Very interesting. There are many ways of assisting or benefiting others that may enhance the feeling of power of those assisting, at the expense of the feeling of power of those assisted. Christian charity is one of Nietzsche's favorite examples, but a modern secular equivalent is the varieties of passive welfare payment. The difficulty for the higher type endowed with the gift-giving virtue is to find ways of enhancing the power of others that also enhance their feeling of power rather than the one of the giving. Let me rephrase that. Rather than that of the one giving. Nietzsche suggests that it is precisely the weakness of human beings that has made the feeling of power one of the most subtle human capacities. He says this: because the feeling of impotence and fear was in a state of almost continuous stimulation so strongly and for so long, the feeling of power has evolved to such a degree of subtlety that in this respect man is now a match for the most delicate gold balance. It has become his strongest propensity. The means discovered for creating this feeling almost constitute the history of culture, unquote. The history of political culture understood in these terms has much to offer contemporary liberal democratic theory, I think. It allows us to see that the traditional accounts of the basis and extent of political authority appeal above all to the fear and impotence of the individuals who make up the political community. It allows us to raise different questions about the nature of authority and institutions in a community of sovereign individuals. Let's see how much time we have here. It seems to me that Nietzsche doesn't criticize egalitarianism or democracy in general, democratic organizations in general, but he does criticize the sort of shapelessness, comfortability, and inability to stand on one's own feet and to think with one's own head. At first sight, Nietzsche almost sounds authoritarian. He provides no explanations, he makes no doubt about his own positions and and he rams his argument left and right. But in fact, he desperately waits for somebody somewhere to stand up and begin to defend all those glorious values, yet there is silence. Everything deserves to perish, he says. Everything is in vain, but not to Nietzsche. True, it is hardly possible to derive from his work any political philosophy, but it is priceless as a shocking wake-up call during indolent times and nihilistic times, and among indifferent people who have no idea what is happening to them and what is in fact coming to engulf them. I'll continue here in a minute.